whilst I've been spending some time with other projects of late, I saw it was the 6th anniversary of Hamster starting their Arcade Archives series of arcade game re-releases for modern systems. It's a series I quite adore, and not just because many arcade games outside of those big ones tend to fall through the cracks, but also because these releases offer so many options for enjoying them with their integrated caravan and high score modes. Plus, Hamster's dedication to the series has brought plenty of unique titles to the fore, including making some of them available to us in the West for the first time, something which is quite special in my book. So, I guess I just wanted to showcase a small selection of them, which I find myself going back to. Ones that, in other words, I just think are neat. First cab off the metaphorical rank is Namco's Assault, released in 1988. Here, you're in charge of a heavy-duty battle tank, and the goal is to fight your way through a number of fortresses before running out of time. The overhead view, combined with the rotation and scaling effects, make this one really stand out for me, at least on a technological level, as scaling effects, at least around this time, were mainly used for faux 3D effects, as you'd see with many a Sega Superscaler arcade game, rather than being used in this way. It's unsurprisingly quite frenetic, and thanks to its tank controls, you might find yourself struggling to get to grips with it at first. But your tank just so happens to offer some extra features which might save you when things are going pear-shaped. Firstly, you could roll from side to side, which will let you sidestep many shots should you time it correctly. There's also a secondary grenade shot, which lets you launch an indirect blast which can take out enemies from a distance. Assault's big trick though comes from the boost pads. Drive onto one of these and you'll be thrown into the air, allowing you to rain damage down from above, greatly expanding your attack range for a brief moment. While Assault may not offer the chaos that many a shmup can be known for, I find it offers a distinctive sense of challenge, especially amongst its peers in the arcade. In fact, I genuinely go as far to say as it's one game which I find more attractive to sit down and play at home, rather than in the confines of an arcade, which for me makes it one that truly shines as part of the Arcade Archives collection. I'll admit, I'm not the biggest platformer fan, especially when it comes to their arcade forms, so the Donkey Kong games don't really get much of my time, outside of an occasional play for curiosity's sake more than anything. But considering that away from ye old games, computers and tech, I tend to be seen as a bit of a black sheep, it so happens that I find myself drawn to gaming's black sheeps too, meaning I just so happen to find myself sharing a bit of a kinship with Donkey Kong 3. As Stanley the Bugman, your goal is simply to spray old Kong to the top of the screen, whilst avoiding the bugs being sent your way, courtesy of his knocking things about. Those bugs pose a double danger, as they'll steal the fruits and vegetables Stanley's tasked with protecting, swooping down at the most inopportune of moments to swipe them away. Which I feel is why I dig this one so much, and why I think many don't. Because Donkey Kong 3 is a gallery shooter in disguise. So there's plenty of trickery to deal with, especially by knowing the dangers certain bugs offer, especially those which appear once you get a few screens in. Compared to others of its ilk, it also has a bit of a surprisingly compact play area, which contributes to some of its overall challenge and distinctiveness as well. It may not be as fluid a game as many of its peers, but I find that just helps differentiate it in the wider picture. Yes, Donkey Kong 3 offers something different, and a look back to the early days of a pioneering games company, which they typically don't show all that often. Once again, striking the importance of one aspect of the Arcade Archive series for me. Everyone loves Galaga, right? But what about the other games in the series which not only came before, but also after Namco's legendary hit? Galaxian offers a simple yet pure challenge, where restrained firing is necessary for the sake of survival. Galaga 88 turns things up a notch, adding lots of extra tricks with its levels and additional ship power-ups. But I feel 1984's Gapless doesn't get the same love. And I can't help but feel it's just as valid an installment in the series as those other games. Sure, at its heart it's quite similar to Galaga, but where it differs, it results in some seriously unique, blasting action. Things start out relatively familiar. You clear out waves of aliens which arrive in small groups, and eventually break formation to attack. Of course, earning more points is done by blasting them as they descend, rather than when they're waiting about in formation. So far, so good. The first major change comes from your ship's upgrades. Instead of sacrificing one of your lives in order to get double firepower, upgrades are obtained from one unique enemy in each wave. Initially, you get the ability to scoop up enemies, adding them to your own firepower, but later on, others become available too, like new weapons. The most dramatic change is in the challenging stages, which have you juggling the approaching aliens, working to spell out bonus on screen. The challenge is in finessing your shots so they don't wipe the enemies off the screen, at least before you milk them for all their worth. It has to be said, Gapless offers a much tougher challenge than Galaga, but if you've put plenty of time into that classic, but still have that craving to blast alien bugs in space, then it's well worth adding it to your rotation of games from the Arcade Archives series. I know what you're thinking at this point. There's been a lot of Namco in this video so far. I'd say I'm sorry, but I'm not really. Their vibe just happens to fit my tastes rather well, I guess. And with 1984's Grobda, you could see one of the reasons why I wanted to put this video together, as it so happens to be one I previously tried but didn't click with. As one of the more recent additions to the Arcade Archives series, at least at the time I'm preparing this video, its release gave me a fresh opportunity to try it out, where it finally clicked for me. It may look like a shooter at first glance, but reality proves otherwise in no short order. As a competitor in the National Battling Association, you must work your way through an array of levels, each taking place on a single screen. Completing them involves you taking out all the enemies, which can be done rather quickly. At least if you're not aiming for a high score, of course. Each destroyed enemy explodes in a style similar to Missile Command, and you can see exactly where I'm going here. If you can lead one enemy into the explosion of another, they'll also be taken out, and you'll get an increasing bonus for each one in the chain. The challenge, though, is in keeping control of your vehicle, which is sluggish, if I were being kind. Though as a secondary offense, you do have a shield, though using it eats up energy, like Pac-Man eats up dots. So judicious use of them is key, particularly because their energy is also shared with your weapons. And with a slow recharge rate, you can see where I'm going here. It could put you in quite the pickle of a situation if you ran out of juice whilst you're surrounded by enemies, unable to take them out. So you can see why Grobda is quite the interesting arcade game. It offers a simple concept, adding some proverbial spanners in the works through its mechanics, making the execution stand out. And it results in one game I feel is genuinely compulsive to play. The joy of the wider Arcade Archive series for me is discovering games which I'd never, ever heard of prior to their release in the series. And Namco's Metal Hawk from 1988 nails this feeling for me on so many levels. Your first impressions might lead you to thinking it's just another overhead shooter, but Metal Hawk is not that at all. Well, it kind of is, but there's a bit more to it than those first impressions might just offer. As the pilot of the titular attack helicopter, you're tasked with undertaking a number of missions in enemy territory. Each mission pits you against the clock, and you'll need to take out enough targets to earn enough points to satisfy the mission's target before time runs out. It might sound run-of-the-mill at first, but you'll find some great set pieces as the missions go on, with one of my favourites being an attack on a high-altitude enemy aircraft which you'll need to dismantle piece by piece. Around that, the mechanics offer plenty of thrilling, blasting action, as you'll need to be tight with the controls to keep up with your targets, whilst avoiding enemy fire from enemies both in the air and from the ground. Even more so as you need to work fast, especially on those later stages where you'll need to nab a load of points to proceed and an increasingly tight time limit to get them in. It's games like this which makes the Arcade Archives series so important, not only in bringing these games to a wider audience, but also for the work in bringing all their versions over as well. As with the case of Metal Hawk, this release brings it to Western audiences for the first time. Something for which I'm incredibly grateful to Hamster for doing, because I don't think I'd have run into it otherwise, and so glad to have it in the list of stuff I go back to on a fairly regular basis. One big surprise amongst the Arcade Archives releases is there aren't many racing games included in the catalogue, but Konami's Road Fighter from 1984 is certainly a more than welcome addition to the series, even if it serves a bit of a throwback to earlier racing games. You take part in a race running over 6 stages, with the goal obviously being to make it to the end, placing as highly as you can in the process. The challenge comes from making sure you don't run out of fuel along the way. Whilst it's slowly consumed by normal driving, crashing out will cost you a significant chunk of your supply, increasing the danger of running out. Unlike most races, should you collide with other vehicles, at least most of them, you'll spin out, giving you a chance at recovering and getting back on the road rather than being sent to your doom. It helps even out some of the challenge, especially that coming from the relatively high speeds you can get up to once you get going. The important thing is keeping your eyes open, not just for those obstacles, but also how the track shifts about, along with the rainbow-coloured cars, which will give you not only extra fuel, but an increasing bonus as well. I'll admit, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the fact that sometimes you've got to collect every fuel pickup to survive, but ultimately, I don't think it gets in the way that much of the racing experience. So do be sure to put the pedal to the metal and aim to take the checkered flag. Road Fighter may not be the most innovative game which sees releasing the Arcade Archive series, but it's one which is a solid contribution and definitely worth checking out. So knowing me, it's probably not much of a surprise that this video has really featured a lot of shooters. It's a genre I'm very much a fan of, and arcade games tended to be where a lot of the great ones landed. So we'll keep the interruption from them going a little bit longer with another racing game. This time, we've got Alpha Denshi's Thrash Rally, released on the Neo Geo in both MVS and AES forms in 1991. Now, for many folks, I'm sure there's another racing game on the Neo Geo which stands out, but as that hasn't been given an Arcade Archives release, I guess we're just going to have to go with this, one of my favourites instead. Thrash Rally, as the name suggests, offers a rallying focus, with you either taking part in a world championship across a number of locales, or the punishing run of the Paris to Dakar Rally. As you'd expect, to progress onto the next leg, you're going to need to complete all the stages without running out of time. something which is easier said than done, even going by arcade standards. As the key to mastering each leg is learning the layout of each stage within. In itself, it's not too difficult, except when you're at speed, of course, but you've also got to get used to your chosen vehicle's handling, making sure you don't oversteer as you corner. Otherwise, you're going to bleed off a little too much speed, which will cost you valuable time as you get back up to it. A minor blemish is that, like many other overhead racing games, it can at times feel that you don't have enough of a lead when it comes to corners. But ultimately, I feel it's really part of the big challenge in mastering Thrash Rally. Now for me, this one is one that just happens to scratch an itch I don't get enough of in racing games. And so, once again, it's another nice contribution to the Arcade Archives catalogue. When I covered Gapless earlier in this video, I mentioned how I feel there's a lot of love for Galaga, but little for the follow-up. This is something I also feel certainly applies with this last game I want to showcase, Konami's Time Pilot 84, released as you guessed, in 1984. The difference is that where Gapless I feel is a worthy successor to Galaga, just one which might not have done enough to differentiate itself, Time Pilot 84 doesn't quite nail what it means to be a successor to the original Time Pilot. Nor do I feel it's underappreciated the way Gapless is. But that doesn't mean it's not an interesting game though. Like the OG Time Pilot, each level has you taking out a number of smaller enemies, which eventually triggers a final boss. Unlike the original, there's no indication of how many are left to take out, so you may feel it had loss at times, with how many more you've got to go. Where its challenge ramps up though is through its new enemies. Alongside tougher aerial ones, you've also got to deal with ground targets. Both these and the bosses can only be taken out with your homing missiles. In order to deploy these, you'll need to get close in with them right ahead of you before a lock-on indicator appears. When active, you can hit your secondary fire button to launch a missile off. Why I feel Time Pilot isn't as tight as the original is for a few reasons. Namely, locking on here is fiddlier than I'd like, and even on the first stage, the enemy shots can be tough to evade as I feel your craft isn't quite as agile as I might have liked. At the same time, it's also a game which has a slower scoring rate, as you don't have as many avenues to rack up the bonus points compared to the original. Despite all this though, I have honestly found myself warming up to Time Pilot 84 lately, and though it's not a patch on the original, I still can't help but find it worth recommending, at least for those with a patch of curiosity. And as always, curiosity is a great thing when it comes to enjoying old games, at least in my book. Now that was just a small slice of the games released through the Arcade Archives series so far. It wasn't easy cutting this down to a reasonable number to showcase here, because seriously, there are so darn many of them released. So I hope these selections have gotten you a little curious, because I'm certainly up for diving into more of them should you be so. And the best way to show that, of course, is to leave some comments. Try some of these out if you haven't already, and let me know what your favourites were out of those I did. Of course, if you've checked out other releases that I may not have covered here, then why not let me know what your favourites of those were as well. The joy of this series of releases for me is discovering games I'd never heard of, something that offers a little different enjoyment, which lets them stand out from the crowd for all their own reasons. It's also really why I love more curatorial focused projects like this. Sure, many of these games can be played in MAME or other such emulators, but having you release a new game at a time really gives you more time to savour in the delights that each one offers, over just simply browsing through collections of anonymous lists of ROM and selecting stuff at random without any real context as to whether or not you might actually be interested. And with all that, what else is there for me to say? It's time to wrap this one up, and as always, thank you all so very much for watching.